Good day, liberators, and welcome back to 200 Years Together by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Before we continue, if you like what I do and you would like to support me, please head over to Patreon and sign up. Or alternatively, if you prefer another platform, head over to Subscribestar. Your help is greatly appreciated. Volume 1. The Jews Before the Revolution. Chapter 1. Before the 19th Century. From the Beginnings in Khazaria. In this book, the presence of the Jews prior to 1772 will not be discussed in detail. However, for a few pages we will go over the older epochs. One could say that the paths of Russians and Jews first crossed in the wars between the Kiev Rus and the Khazars, ancient people of the Turkish race established in the region of the Low Volga since long. In the 6th century they founded a vast empire stretching from the Ural to Dnieper, which fell in the 10th century after their defeat by the Prince of Kiev, Sviatoslav, 966. But that isn't completely right, since only the upper class of the Khazars were of Hebraic descent. The tribe itself consisted of Turks who converted to Judaism. If one follows the presentation of J.D. Bruskas, respected Jewish author of the mid-20th century, a certain part of the Jews from Persia moved across the Derbent Pass to Lower Volga, where Atil on the west coast of Caspian, on the Volga Delta, the capital city of the Khazarian Khanate, rose up starting 724 AD. The tribal princes of the Turkish Khazars, at the time still idol worshippers, did not want to accept the Muslim faith, lest they should be subordinated to the Caliph of Baghdad, nor Christianity lest they come under vassalage to the Byzantine emperor, and so the clan went over to the Jewish faith in 732. But there was also a Jewish colony in the Bosporan kingdom on the Temen Peninsula, at the east end of the Crimea, separating the Black Sea from the Sea of Azov, to which Hadrian had Jewish captives brought in 137 after the victory over Bar Kokhba, founded in 480 BC by the Greek, conquered by Mithridate in 107 BC, remained under Roman protectorate until the 4th century. Later, a Jewish settlement sustained itself without break under the Goths and Huns in the Crimea. Kaffa, Feodosia, especially remained Jewish. In 933, Prince Igor, Grand Prince of Kiev, 912 till 945, successor of Oleg the Wise, temporarily possessed Kerch, and his son Sviatoslav, Grand Prince 960 till 972, wrested the Don region from the Khazars. The Kiev Rus already ruled the entire Volga region including Atil in 909, and Russian ships appeared at Samandar south of Atil on the west coast of the Caspian. The Kumyks, Turkish-speaking people, independent state in the 15th century, annexed to Russia in 1784, in the Caucasus were descendants of the Khazars. In the Crimea, on the other hand, they combined with the Polovtsi, Turkish-speaking people from Asia that occupied the southern steppes of Russia 11th century, a nomadic Turkish people from Central Asia who had lived in the northern Black Sea area and the Caucasus since the 10th century, called Cuman by Western historians. This admixture formed the Crimean Tatars. But unlike the Tatars, the Karaim, Turkish-speaking people professing a belief similar to Judaism, but without recognizing the Talmud, 11th to 12th century, a Jewish sect that does not follow the Talmud, and Jewish residents of Crimea did not go over to the Muslim faith. The Khazars were finally overrun much later by Tamerlane or Timur, the 14th century conqueror. A few researchers, however, hypothesize, exact proof is absent, that the Hebrews had wandered to some extent through the South Russian region in a westward and northwesterly direction. Thus, the Orientalist and Semitist Abraham Harkavy, for example, writes that the Jewish congregation in the future Russia, quote, emerged from Jews that came from the Black Sea coast and from the Caucasus, where their ancestors had lived since the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, end quote. J.D. Bruskas also leans to this perspective. Another opinion suggests these were the remnant of the 10 lost tribes of Israel after the death of Solomon under the rule of Rehoboam. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel separated from the house of David formed the kingdom of Israel and then were punished and dispersed. This migration presumably ended after the conquest in 1097 of Tatarans on the eastern shore of the Kerch Straits, overlooking the eastern end of the Crimean Peninsula, the eastern flank of the old Bosporan kingdom by the Poloptsi. According to Harkavy's opinion, the vernacular of these Jews, at least since the 9th century, was Slavic, and only in the 17th century, when the Ukrainian Jews fled from the pogroms of the Ukrainian Cossack warlord Bogdan Chmelnytsky, Hetman Ukrainian leader, 1593 till 1657, victoriously led the Ukrainian Cossacks against Poland with the aid of the Crimean Tatars. In 1654, he received the protection of Moscow and became the vassal of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, who led a successful Cossack rebellion against Poland with the help of the Crimean Tatars. Did Yiddish become the official language of Jews in Poland? In various manners, the Jews already came to Kiev and settled there. Already under Igor, the lower part of the city was called Khazars. In 933, Igor brought the Jews that had been taken captive in Kerch. Then, in 965, Jews taken captive in the Crimea were brought there. In 969, Khazars from Atil and Samander. In 989 from Cherson, and in 1017 from Tatar. In Kiev, Western or Ashkenazi Jews also emerged in connection with the caravan traffic from west to east, and starting at the end of the 11th century, perhaps on the account of the persecution in Europe during the First Crusade. Later, researchers confirmed likewise that in the 11th century the Jewish element in Kiev was derived from the Khazars. Still earlier, at the turn of the 10th century, the presence of, quote, a Khazar force and a Khazar garrison, end quote, was chronicled in Kiev. And, quote, already in the first half of the 11th century, the Jewish Khazar element in Kiev played a significant role, end quote. In the 9th and 10th century, Kiev was multinational and tolerant towards different ethnicities. At the end of the 10th century, in the time when Prince Vladimir I. Sviatoslavich, Saint Vladimir 956 till 1015, son of Sviatoslav, became sole sovereign of the Kievan Russia, of which he is considered the founder. Converted to Byzantine Christianity, which he established in the whole country in 988 AD, was choosing a new faith for the Russians. There were not a few Jews in Kiev, and among them were found educated men who suggested taking on the Jewish faith. The choice fell out otherwise than it had 250 years earlier in the Khazar kingdom. The Russian historian Karimsin relates it like this, quote, after he, Vladimir, had listened to the Jews, he asked them where their homeland was. In Jerusalem, answered the delegates, but God has chastised us in his anger and sent us into a foreign land. And you, whom God has punished, dare to teach others? Said Vladimir. We do not want to lose our fatherland like you have. After the Christianization of the Rus, according to Broskas, a portion of the Khazar Jews in Kiev also went over to Christianity, and afterwards in Novgorod, perhaps one of them, Luka Zhidyata, was even one of the first bishops and spiritual writers. Christianity and Judaism being side by side in Kiev inevitably led to the learned zealousy contrasting them. From that emerged the work significant to Russian literature, Sermon on Law and Grace by Hilarion, first Russian metropolitan, in the middle 11th century, which contributed to the settling of a Christian consciousness for the Russians that lasted for centuries. The polemic here is as fresh and lively as in the letters of the apostles. In any case, it was the first century of Christianity in Russia. For the Russian neophytes of that time, the Jews were interesting, especially in connection to their religious presentation, and even in Kiev there were opportunities for contact with them. The interest was greater than later in the 18th century, when they again were physically close. Then, for more than a century, the Jews took part in the expanded commerce in Kiev. Quote, in the new city wall completed in 1037, there was the Jews' Gate, which closed in the Jewish quarter. End quote. The Kiev Jews were not subjected to any limitations, and the princes did not handle themselves with hostility, but rather indeed vouchsafed to them protection, especially Sviatopluk Izyaslavich, Prince of Novgorod, 1078 till 1087, and Grand Prince of Kiev from 1093 until 1113, since the trade and enterprising spirit of the Jews brought the princes financial advantage. In 1113 AD, Vladimir Monomakh, out of qualms of conscience, even after the death of Svyatopluk, hesitated to ascend to the Kiev throne prior to one of the Svyatoslaviches, and, quote, rioters exploiting the anarchy, plundered the house of the regimental commander Putyata and all Jews that had stood under the special protection of the greedy Svyatopluk in the capital city. One reason for the Kiev revolt was apparently the usury of the Jews. Exploiting the shortage of money of the time, they enslaved the debtors with exorbitant interest. For example, there are indicators in the statute of Vladimir Monomakh that Kiev moneylenders received interest up to 50% per annum. Karamzin therein appeals to the chronicles and an extrapolation by Basil Tatishev, 1686–1750, student of Peter the Great and the first Russian historian. In Tatishev we find moreover, quote, afterwards they clubbed down many Jews and plundered their houses, because they had brought about many sicknesses to Christians, and commerce with them had brought about great damage. Many of them who had gathered in their synagogue seeking protection defended themselves as well as they could, and gained time until Vladimir could arrive, end quote. But when he came, quote, the Kievites pleaded with him for retribution towards the Jews, because they had taken all the trades from Christians, and under Svyatopluk had had much freedom and power. They had also brought many over to their faith. According to M.N. Pogrovsky, the Kiev pogrom of 1113 was of a social and not national character. However, the leaning of this class-conscious historian towards social interpretations is well known. After he ascended to the Kiev throne, Vladimir answered the complainants, quote, since many Jews everywhere have received access to the various princely courts and have migrated there, it is not appropriate for me, without the advice of the princes, and moreover contrary to the right, to permit killing and plundering them. Hence I will without delay call the princes to assemble and give counsel. End quote. In the council a law limiting interest was established, which Vladimir attached to Yaroslav's statute. Karimzin reports, appealing to Tatishev, that Vladimir, quote, banned all Jews, end quote, upon the conclusion of the council, quote, and from that time forth there were none left in our fatherland, end quote. But at the same time he qualifies, quote, in the chronicles in contrast it says that in 1124 the Jews in Kiev died in a great fire, consequently they had not been banned, end quote. Ruskas explains that it, quote, was a whole quarter in the best part of the city, at the Jews' gate next to the Golden Gate, end quote. Ruskas explains that it, quote, was a whole quarter in the best part of the city, at the Jews' gate next to the Golden Gate, end quote. At least one Jew enjoyed the trust of Andrei Bogolyubsky in Vladimir. Among the confidants of Andrei was a certain Ephraim Moisich, whose patronymic Moisich or Moishevich indicates his Jewish derivation, and, according to the words of the chronicle, was among the instigators of the treason by which Andrei was murdered. However, there is also notation that says under Andrei Bogolyubsky, quote, many Bulgarians and Jews from the Volga territory came and had themselves baptized, end quote, and that after the murder of Andrei, his son Georgy fled to a Jewish prince in Dagestan. In any case, the information on the Jews in the time of the Zustal Rus is scanty, as their numbers were obviously small. The Jewish Encyclopedia notes that in the Russian heroic songs by Lenin, the, quote, Jewish Tsar, end quote, for example, the warrior Shidowin in the old Bailina about Ilya and Obriana is, quote, a favorite general moniker for an enemy of the Christian faith, end quote. At the same time, it could also be a trace of memories of the struggle against the Khazars. Here, the religious basis of this hostility and exclusion is made clear. On this basis, the Jews were not permitted to settle in the Muscovy Rus. The invasion of the Tatars portended the end of the lively commerce of the Kiev Rus, and many Jews apparently went to Poland. Also, the Jewish colonization into Volhynia and Galicia continued, where they had scarcely suffered from the Tatar invasion. The encyclopedia explains, quote, during the invasion of the Tatars, 1239, which destroyed Kiev, the Jews also suffered, but in the second half of the 13th century, they were invited by the Grand Princes to resettle in Kiev, which found itself under the domination of the Tatars. On account of the special rights, which were also granted the Jews in other possessions of the Tatars, Envy was stirred up in the town residents against the Kiev Jews. Something similar happened not only in Kiev but also in the cities of North Russia, which, quote, under the Tatar rule, were accessible for many merchants from Khorizm or Khiva, who were long since experienced in trade and the tricks of profit-seeking. These people bought from the Tatars the principality's right to levy tribute. They demanded excessive interest from poor people and, in case of their failure to pay, declared the debtors to be slaves and took away their freedom. The residents of Vladimir, Zhustal and Rostov finally lost their patience and rose up together at the pealing of the bells against these usurers. A few were killed and the rest chased off." End quote. A punitive expedition of the Khan against the mutineers was threatened, which however was hindered by the mediation of Alexander Nevsky. Lastly, quote, in the documents of the 15th century, Kievite Jewish tax leasers are mentioned who possessed a significant fortune. End quote.